house is full of dogs.
That was Lucy Lippard, one of the voices who's truly defined contemporary art criticism. And as you can see here, these are some of the many dozens of books, monographs, and anthologies she's contributed. Everything from surrealism to feminist art to land art and everything in between. Her book on Eva Hesse in particular was very influential because it was one of the first to combine biography as well as criticism, art history, and some personal insights, helping redefine what a book about an artist could and should be. She invited us to her home in Galisteo, New Mexico, where I had the pleasure of recording this podcast. Now picture it. It is a very dry, windy plain just at the foot of the mountains in New Mexico. It's a small town, and I went and, as you heard, knocked on her door. She was kind enough to let us in and open up about her own experiences and loves of art, writing, and the world. In order to get a fuller picture of Lucy's world and work, we also are speaking to two other brilliant women. First of all, Catherine Morris, the senior curator at the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum. Back in 2012, she curated Materializing 6 Years, Lucy Lippard and the Emergence of Conceptual Art, which is based on this book right here. And then Susan B., a painter, book artist, and editor who is part of the same 1970s art world where Lucy was an emerging and prominent figure. My name is Hudag Vartanyan, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. We have a lot to get to, so let's get back to the conversation.
So I'm here at Galisteo, the small, it's a village? Is it a town?
It's a village. It's 250 people.
250 people. And you've lived here now for 30 years?
Almost 30 years, yeah.
30 years. Now, how did you find this place?
Oh, feminists. Judy Chicago knew about it, and her now husband was working for Agnes Martin and lived here and was building his own house here. And then Harmony Hammond moved here, and she was very close to me because of the heresies and everything. And I was staying with her, and I looked across the creek, and there was a sign that this strip was being sold off. And then my mother died, so I had some money for the first time in my life, and bought it and built this little house.
What was it that ignited your imagination?
Well, Galisteo. I remember walking I was hiking there's a big petroglyph site further down the road, and I was hiking there, and I walked across the bridge, and I thought, this place is foreign. It was, I liked it, but it was foreign. And I ended up by living here. So at first, it's so quiet here. When I was first living here, it's changed quite a lot.
So there is this image of the 1970s contemporary art world in New York being very political.
Well, we were much more political. I was always an activist in the 70s, and all my friends were. So, I would tell people when I moved down here, I'd say that I'm getting away from art, and my artist friends would look pissed, sort of. And so I was actually getting away from the art world, and clearly I never succeeded in getting away from art. But
here I am.
Yeah, right. Well, art, it turned out, I wanted to write fiction. When I graduated from college, I'd gotten a couple fiction prizes and had stories published and stuff. And I thought, well, I'm a hot shit, and I'm going to do that. And I'm really glad that I was really bad at writing the kind of fiction anybody would want to publish. And I'm glad I was already spending a lot of time on art, and I'm glad I ended up writing about art, because everything I get interested in, I can look around and there's some artists who are interested in it too, and so there's something to talk about and write about.
So you did mention once talking about art criticism being a form of fiction. I think you mentioned that once. I think somewhere that I remember reading.
That was clever.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Like, how true is that for you still?
I don't know what I was really. I guess everything is fiction on one level or another, especially these days. Right. But one thing that interested me about writing about art, when I realized that was what I was going to end up by doing, was that it's almost impossible to write about art. I like that. I've always been interested in words and images, and there isn't any real way of talking about art unless you see it. And so that was challenging. So I have always listened to artists, which was, not done in the late 50s when I came to New York. I mean, you weren't ever supposed to use the word I, God forbid. Right. And you certainly weren't. I mean, Dory Ashton was fired from the Times because she knew, in the biblical sense, knew artists. She was too close to artists, married to one, and so on, and so was I. And I was happy to be, that was where I learned everything I know about art, was artists.
I think that Lucy would say it all started with the artist, plain and simple. She has said to me that, she learned from artists, from being in studios, from being at dinners, from drinking and hanging out. And I think that's still true. I do believe that the emergence of the conceptual movement in the 60s and 70s is one of the most important art historical moments of the 20th century, and one that we're still grappling with. My name's Catherine Morris. I'm the senior curator of the Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum.
And so the topic, of course, is Lucy Lippard, who is somebody who you've worked with for an exhibition you organized roughly 10 years ago now. So can you tell us a little bit about, first of all, describe Lucy Lippard for someone who may not know who she is, and what role she plays in the art community, in art criticism, in art, in museums, and why you felt so interested in her work?
Lucy is, in my mind, in the generation that I grew up in, an integral part of the art world, an integral part of the kind of people who made an intellectual framing of conceptual art and feminism that I learned and grew up with and believed in fully, and still do. And she is a person who fascinated me because she is absolutely a part of the art world, but she's also a person that I think kind of holds herself at a bit as a reserve from that world. I think that becomes part of a critical distance. I also think it's a personality, and I think that it informs the way that she takes up the work that she does in relationship, particularly to conceptual art, and the artists who were a part of her circle at that time.
My parents loved art, and they went to, not contemporary galleries that much, but they went to museums, and they both painted amateur watercolor painting. And actually both were not bad, for local things. And when I started writing about art in my sort of formalist period, Daddy said, he said, and I don't really understand what you're talking about a lot of the time. And I thought, here's an intelligent person who is well-educated and likes art, and he doesn't understand what I'm talking about. This is not good. And so I tried to clean up my act a little. It never fully worked, because to be in the art world, you have to do some of that stuff. But I've managed to, say what I wanted to say and get away with it on some levels.
I guess because there's still this kind of concept, and I think it's something propagated by maybe academic programs.
Yeah.
That this kind of super jargony, slogany language.
Oh, theory. It's probably just because I'm too lazy to deal with theory, but I've always called theory ideas with hardening of the arteries.
Right.
Because, and I've never been an academic, and none of them liked me, and That's fine. Hilton Kramer once said, Lucy Lippard was looking like a really good art historian until she, and I'll never forget this quote, until she fell prey to the radical whirlwind. And I did, and proud of it, and so on.
Nobody reads Hilton Kramer anymore. But at the time, he was the most important art critic in New York. My name is Susan B., and I'm an artist who lives in Brooklyn. And I've been a member of AIR, which is the first feminist art co-op for women that started in 1972. The reason I'm so excited about talking about Lucy Lippard is that when I was in graduate school at Hunter in the 70s, like 75 to 77, it was all male art teachers. This was graduate school, right? There wasn't a woman to be found except in the art history department, but certainly not teaching studio art. And she became this very important icon to us at the time, even going back to the 60s, because she's somebody who came out of the minimalist movement, and she understood conceptual art and artist books and all of these things that were very important, performance art, that were very important in the 60s and 70s. But she actually made the move out of just supporting male artists, which is pretty much all that was happening at the time, to supporting women artists and writing about them, and to centering feminist art, which was a very chancy thing at the time. When AIR started in 1972, it was the first women's gallery, and the idea of having women getting together and doing a gallery was considered such a bad idea, by the art world, that she was very supportive of these early feminist artists, and also very involved with politics and with artist books. So at the time, she was somebody really crucial. Like, I would go to see her talk, and I would feel really inspired by her. Also, because she had an art history background, she was really well known as an art critic, and well known also for supporting male minimalist artists, male conceptual artists. So it wasn't that she was just coming out of nowhere. As an art historian, she already had all the respect, but the fact that she was willing to put herself out and support women made it very important for our time period that back then. And of course, she continues to age 87 now. So she's really been an icon for a very long time. Have to think also that the Guerrilla Girls was happening at that time. All these people were picketing, museums. You had Harlem on My Mind, which had no Black artists in it. I mean, there was crazy stuff like that going on that now it's almost, you can't really think back and realize how segregated the art world was in terms of artists, women artists, artists of color, gay artists. I mean, whatever it was, people didn't talk about certain things. People never brought up certain things. And I guess it's hard to reconstruct that era because everything was just sort of coming into being. She was less judgmental, I would say, and more open to what was happening. So she could talk to somebody like Anna Mangetta or Mary Beth Edelson, people who were doing performance work using their bodies in ways that were considered, kind of considered wrong at the time, putting themselves in their work. All these things that were kind of percolating, and she was on the ground with it. In other words, she didn't divorce herself from the art world. I mean, she, was involved with the minimalists, she was involved with conceptualists, she was involved with feminists, with the political people. What she probably wasn't involved with was the mainstream art world at the time, but she made herself part of the scene at the time with more experimental writers, with more experimental performers, with people starting out. And that gave the whole scene much more credence because she could write and she could put it forward in a way that made sense to the outside world, I think. Because, she was a trained art historian. She wasn't coming completely out of left field when she was out of left field for sure. But I mean, she was a leftist for sure. But she was able to really penetrate these mainstream worlds, I think, in a very interesting way, which you see now with certain critics, in Hyperallergic and other places where you're able to make a difference by putting forward certain work or, talking about, Harlem in a different way than it was talked of at the time. I mean, I saw that original Harlem show. It was just photos of Harlem. I mean, I was going to high school in Harlem. This was what was I looking at? You might as well just get on the bus and go to Harlem. There was really no point to it.
So that hasn't changed again.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Well,
Lucy, what are we doing?
Yeah, you're doing it now. I'm on the fringes.
But do you know what I mean?
It's all your fault.
Oh, God.
The next generation, I would love to hear what you think your generation did to change any of this.
Well, I mean, I think my generation, when I was going to school, was in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And I think we sort of responding to the multiculturalism, which you've written about extensively, and we were trying to sort of reconsider the sort of orthodoxies, right?
Yeah.
And I think we did a good job in terms of at least like realizing that there isn't this only modernist notion of art history.
Yeah.
But the problem was we were never, like, the market also bloomed at the same time. And the reality was that so much of what we've considered the art system for so long has been sort of dictated and funded by the commercial market.
Well, we're in a capitalist society. Surprise, surprise.
Well, but at the same time, it's like, I think that's why Hyperallergic was created, partly was because we were like, okay, well, we're not interested in that. So our funders tend to be, we have membership, we have, art schools, we have museums, we have foundations, all these types of things. So it's like, it's not, galleries are not the focus.
Yeah, right.
But unfortunately, this corporate tendency in the art world, I think, really took away some of the DIY stuff, or at least then monetized it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's what I discovered in the late 50s and early 60s. Before the 60s got going, I was beginning to suspect, that you think you're free in the art world, and then you realize there's a wall right over there, and it's capitalism.
Right.
And there's,
That's right.
And there's how to, and you have to make a living. My first book was on the prints and drawings of Philip Evergood.
Right.
Because
I read that.
Yeah, and I discovered another art world completely that I'd never even known existed. Raphael Sawyer and Evergood's old pals, and it was a perfect book for me because Evergood stayed a communist long after he should have not been a communist. But anyway,
I'm so glad you brought this up because I was going to ask you about that because it seemed really out of the ordinary considering the trajectory you were on. At least initially, it seemed like.
The Evergood book.
Yeah.
It was my first book. I would have, I was writing for money, such as it was.
Right. But do you really credit that with opening your mind up to this different narratives? Or how do you,
not to different narratives so much. I knew about, I was well educated about art.
But by the early 60s,
but I didn't know there was a cadre of,
Got it.
Artists who had their own art world. They had their own galleries, they had their own collectors. And when I wandered in, I thought, oh, it's just like our art world. Like this other one over here. And then, of course, there are lots of those.
So now I want to go to the question of image and text. Because that's actually been one of the central ideas that draws my life and work.
Sure, yeah. What interested me about image and text was that was partly that I wanted to be a writer, but I was interested in art, and I knew there was this gap of perception and of words. And then conceptual art happened, and that was really a huge opening up for me.
So what was it like creating an art exhibit for someone who isn't necessarily an artist, right? She does sort of fall between categories in many ways. But what was that like?
That was the fun of it. There were so many parts of that exhibition that Vincent and I had so many thoughts about. And what's interesting to me about that show, and the thing that I think surprised people, as a curator of a Center for Feminist Art, one would think I would do an exhibition on Lucy's feminist writing. But it was really important to me and to Vincent to do this work starting with conceptual art because Lucy has talked about sort of moving away from conceptual art and into feminist art because she felt like conceptual art wasn't political enough. She got to the point in life where she really wanted to be actively political. And I think now, then, 10 years ago, 40 years later, whatever it was, we saw the politics in that conceptual practice that didn't feel as vital to her at the time. But so for me to make the clear link between how conceptual practices that Lucy was interested in, not all conceptual practices, was very much linked to a politics that she was a part of and that feminism grows from. I think there's also a way in which the history of conceptual art and the history of feminist art are really inextricably linked.
So now, how would you, looking back at Lucy's, you talk about the politics and sort of like she was a little frustrated with the politics of conceptualism. Now, in retrospect, what were some of those radical things that she may have not seen at first?
The numbers shows that Lucy did, which she's so famous for doing. The last one was circa 7,500, which was the first all-women and arguably the first feminist show she did. Not arguably, it is. And that's where we ended our exhibition, and that's where she talks about having kind of made this conscious decision to turn her attention to this socio-political movement that was grounded in conceptualism but had a more overt political drive.
How would you describe the numbers shows for those who are listening and may not know what those are?
The numbers show was another kind of idea that Lucy had for how to democratize exhibitions. She called them her suitcase exhibitions as well. She invited artists to submit ideas for works of art, conceptual works of art, to be included in an exhibition on 3x5 cards. She would then take those 3x5 cards and she would go to the sites and produce the works as they were described on these 3x5 cards. And she did 3 different versions of it, some of which she considers more successful than other. And it was a way to kind of pass the baton. She could take these cards and she could make a show, she could pass them on to somebody else to do it. An artist could offer an idea that then in reality becomes almost a collective action. So the names of the shows were based on the population numbers of the cities where they were held. And you can still find in rare bookshops today, the cards became the catalog for the show. So flipping through the 3x5 cards, again, is Lucy's variation and idea of a catalog. Again, as she put it, you could put them in any kind of order you liked. You can throw away the ones you don't like. You know, it is another sort of conceptual activity that becomes part of the collective process.
I collaborated with artists and I was, wrote things, but it was part of the art. And since they were doing text too, it didn't make me. And people said, "Oh, Lucy wants to be an artist," and I never wanted to be an artist. I always was a writer. But I could collaborate with artists. I could do whatever the hell I wanted. When I did what people call now the card catalog shows or the number shows in 1969-70, Peter Plagins wrote about it in Art Forum or someplace and said, "Lucy wants to be an artist." She's really the artist of all this stuff. And that was annoyed hell out of me. But anyway, that doesn't have anything to do with image and text. But then
I think it does. I think part of this, one of the reasons I'm interested in this topic is because there's this strange gatekeeping around art writers and sort of what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. But there isn't the same rules with artists.
No. Artists are the free spirits, and
they can write things, and they can, and no one ever
but
says they stop being an artist.
But they didn't write things that much. I mean,
Donald Judd did.
Oh yeah, no, but starting or in the '60s,
right?
In Smithson and so forth and so on.
But historically, in the academies, people did write. The artists in the academies wrote a little bit. Joshua Reynolds.
But they didn't write about other people's work that much, did they?
Not that much.
But then, so conceptual art, I did I tried to make pictures into words in a series of things called photo dialogues or something. And I tried to do a paragraph of text and then a picture and then pick up from the picture the next paragraph. I mean, it sounded like a good idea, but it never really worked. I don't think people they just looked at the picture and went on to the text or something. Or just looked at the pictures and never looked at the text or whatever. So.
Or maybe they read it differently now than they did then. Just like good art, sometimes good art writing takes some time to seep in.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see myself as a genius art writer. I see myself as sort of a hack. I mean, frankly. I mean, I've made a living at this. I mean, I did a talk at the New School about criticism a few years ago, and one of the questions is, what do you do about writer's block? And I said, I don't. This is how I make my living. I don't get blocked. I mean, I've written some stupid things and some bad things and so forth, but I write.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm sure you do, and most people do. I mean, I think art writers don't get writer's block because we're not respected enough to have writer's block. We're not creative enough to have writer's block.
I think part of the reason that Lucy feels like a bit of an enigma is because, she didn't think of herself as a critic. She thought of herself as a novelist or a writer. And so I think that contributes to the way she positioned herself in the world, because she didn't define herself by those terms that most people seem to want to, which obviously also defines all of her work, including the book 6 Years, which my great colleague Vincent Bonan and I did an exhibition on.
She also was a writer. I should say that she wrote some very good fiction, which she never really pursued. But in the experimental writing world, she was also known. So, I mean, on all of those levels, I think her importance is very, it's almost underrated, I think, because in a way, I don't think people now really know her work.
So why do you think, like, with artists, there's often this idea of, like, they can create different bodies of work, but with art writers, I feel like there's less flexibility in people's imagination about what we do. Why? Why do you think that is?
I have no idea. I mean, I've just always felt like I could be as flexible as I wanted because I'm a freelancer. I mean, you know, I don't have any kind of, never had a boss. But,
so let's talk about that part. It's because I know that you often joke that you have a problem with authority.
I'm an only child. Maybe that's it.
But at the end of the day, as a freelancer, you do and you don't have freedom, right? Because you still have to appeal to a certain, like, you know, publication.
Yeah, you want people to have you write again. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I wonder how you navigated that.
I was never very aware of navigating anything. I've always had a lot of energy. I don't anymore, but I used to have and I just went ahead and did what I wanted to do. And if somebody didn't like it, I mean, there were plenty of projects that didn't happen and grants I didn't get. And I stopped applying for grants at one point because it just, like, why bother? I remember we used to have a discussion around in the early 80s about whether activist artists should be trying to get into museums or in galleries and so on. And a lot of people just said, you know, we get co-opted if we go in there, we have to stay on our own and stay in the co-op galleries or no gallery at all and so on. And then Leon Golub, who was certainly an admirable activist, said, no, we belong in the museums too, and our art is important, and these messages that we have are important. And I was totally convinced once he did that. I mean, you know, I still prefer the margins for myself, but artists, I mean, like, I have artist friends who say, well, you're so lucky, you can not make much money and you can live. I mean, it's true. They have to buy materials. I mean, painters, I'm thinking.
Sure, I get it.
And
sculptors, definitely.
Yeah,
sculptors.
And sculptors, definitely. And going out and getting things out of the gutter doesn't work for everybody.
So now, getting back to image and text,
yeah, I know.
which seems
you're
to be so
not getting
elusive.
what you want. I don't know what it is.
I'm actually really fascinated by it. Like, the fact that because this seems to be a central thing for you, but at the same time, you seem to not want to talk about it.
Well, no, this is a problem. I was interviewed by somebody fairly recently who kept on with these wonderful sort of theoretical ideas about writing, and she said, "Now, do you think that? And do you think about that?" No. So, you know, basically, I just kind of do what I do. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. So, I really don't know where to go with it. I mean, obviously, if you're an art writer, you're dealing with image and text, and people do it in different ways.
But I think some writers actually feel very divorced. Like, you read their stuff, and you're like, do they have eyes? You know, like, that happens too, right? Or they just never choose good images, and you kind of wonder about their visual literacy when they can't, like, even, you know, take a simple, straightforward, you know, informational photograph or something, or figure out how to tell the story with images. Do you know? So it's like, I think maybe, and I do wonder sometimes whether it's the academia part of the art world, because they don't know what to do with images sometimes. Do you know? Because no one gets tenure based on the images in your paper. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's just not like the way the system kind of works. Yeah. So I guess that's what I'm trying to understand.
I also was never going to go into academia, so I really don't. I mean, I had a college boyfriend who was in law school, and he said, "You're a good thinker, but you're a shallow thinker." And I thought about it. I was a little insulted, but I was in college. I didn't know what kind of thinker I was, period. And then I always thought afterwards, oh, he's probably right. You know, I write about what I write, and I don't dig into it too much. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about writing. I just write.
Can I offer another interpretation?
You know, yeah.
I mean, maybe it's that you don't stake your identity on these ideas in the same way. I wonder.
Yeah, no, I don't stake my identity on any particular.
Because I do think a lot of people do that.
Because that's why that book, Changing, is called Changing.
Right. That's right.
And I've never seen anything wrong with changing, and the art world doesn't approve. I look at Guston being the classic example.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I wonder, like, is it that flexibility that has also made you so relevant for so many decades?
I have no idea why I'm so relevant. I mean, I don't. This is not false modesty. I really just have no idea, because I have always just kind of gone ahead and done what the hell I wanted to do. I used to want to be liked, and I've stopped that because I realized, these people don't like me.
I always say, most people don't like themselves, so why are they going to like you? I think there's a grain of truth in that.
But I don't know where else to go with this image and text thing. I mean, ideas come to you, and you think, well, I'll try that. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't.
But where do you think the seed of that came from? Because I can't believe that it just sort of like naturally evolved.
Well, I mean, I've seen. I mean, obviously, art is my education. I mean, I used to see 30 shows a week or something. I mean, I've seen one hell of a lot of art. I mean, more art than is healthy for anybody, I think.
Absolutely.
But I was writing for Art International. That was just a sort of lucky break because Max Kozloff was a friend, and he and Barbara Rose were writing for Art International, and then they quit within a month or two of each other. And Max recommended me, and Jim Fitzsimmons was desperate, so. And he would have had, I never told him I was pregnant when I started because he would have had a fit to know that the Art International New York letter person was running around.
Really? So it's classic sexism.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know what sexism was then, but I intuited that I should not say I'm having a baby. I mean,
right.
And I missed a couple of shows, and I said, well, I'm sorry. I just had a kid, that's why I missed the show.
Right.
And he was like,
oh, jeez. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, the role of sexism in the early part of your career? Like, how did that happen?
There again, when I got into the women's movement in 1970, basically, I've always just sort of, I guess, had a thick skin or something, because I never really noticed much. And as a freelancer, I didn't ever know that somebody got the job instead of me, or somebody was being paid more. I found out later that the guys were getting paid a lot more, but it's okay. I was making a living anyway. So, but and then I started hearing women's stories and women artist stories, and I don't think it was that hard on critics, except for the Story Ashland story, where she was told she knew artists too much. But artists were really, God, when I heard these stories from women, I mean, it's just. I remember one dealer telling me in the early 70s about Mary Miss. She'd shown him her work and was interested in being in the gallery, and he didn't take her on. And I said, God, why didn't you? I don't know who it was. And he said, oh, well, I loved her work, but she was so beautiful, I was afraid I'd be taking it for the wrong reasons. I mean, I nearly died, sort of like, what?
Wow. So I think that's something that I think maybe generations following, like, we don't understand, because that was never, like, we thought, like, how did people not see this?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that was really, like, you didn't see it because you didn't really have a word for it. You didn't see other people's experience, so you didn't know this was a pattern.
Exactly.
It's hard to even think back on the time period. You couldn't really find any women in any of the museums. You couldn't find books about women artists. And here I was, marooned with these minimalist male artists at Hunter, and just going to these Monday night series at AIR where they had different women critics and male critics talking about feminist art. And we had somebody like Rosalind Krauss, who was actually my thesis advisor, who was against women's art, and she'd come out and say things like that. And so, as a young artist who was starting out, it was so important to have these essays and to have Lucy take seriously women's art organizations willing to write the essay for the first print portfolio of AIR, which was in 1976. And these essays were really, really crucial. I don't think, from the perspective of the present day, where you can see women in museums, you can go to the Whitney Biennial and might be half women. But for years we were marching. I mean, I remember going to demonstrations that she was at, literally with signs in front of museums, trying to get women and also persons of color shown. When people say, oh, it happened, well, it didn't just happen. None of this stuff happened. It was really a fight. And sometimes when I hear people say, oh, well, now you can just see X and Y in the museum, you can, see women's art at the Met, and you can see, all sorts of things that you couldn't see in the 70s, but it didn't happen by mistake.
Yeah, I mean, we really just, life was what it was. I went to a women's college. I went to Smith, and
you went to Smith?
Yeah. Why?
Why do so many awesome women in the art world come from Smith?
I don't know. Women's colleges are a good thing. I mean, my mother had gone to Smith, and she and my father were both. She was a church mouse, and my father was just poor, working class, and class identity is not something Americans like to even think about.
Ever.
And we did a Heresies issue on class.
Heresies is a journal, a feminist journal.
Feminist Journal of Art and Politics. And when we were founding it, we had what we call the Mother Collective, and then the different issue collectives. If somebody was interested in doing a lesbian thing, Harmony did a lesbian issue. But anyway, the class thing. We said, okay, we'll do an issue on class. Let's go around the table and talk about class and our own lived experience.
Uh-oh.
And it was so funny because we all wanted to be working class, and a lot of us had come from, usually one thing away. My father was raised working class, but by the time he got into college at Yale at the age of 16, he wasn't working class anymore. I mean, and my mother, the same with my mother, and so on. So that was sort of fascinating. Well, my grandmother was a farmer. Well, did she own the farm? Then we started in on all this stuff. It was very interesting.
So what did you learn from that? Because I think that's exactly what kind of happens.
Well, we knew that Americans don't like to talk about class. Right. And so we thought we will talk about class. And I learned a lot about my friends and our pretensions.
Yep. Right.
And I include myself in that. But I never forgot my parents' story. My parents said to me at one point, because they were in the upper middle class by then, and they said, "Why do you hate the rich?" And I said, "Because of your stories, of your childhoods and youth and so on, and getting into college and so forth." And when my mother was at Smith, there was one dorm for scholarship students. They were all in one place. Right. And she said she didn't mind because they were interesting people, and that she had more in common with them than she did with the rich kids in the other place. But I mean, a lot of these, they didn't know what they were telling me, and I listened to this stuff really carefully. And it made a big impression on me.
So I wonder what happened at the Village Voice. Like what was? Can you explain your?
Well, that new guy whose name I have blocked, Kiff something, came in as the editor. And I had been hired to write once a month, for God's sakes.
This was the mid-'80s?
Early 80s.
Early 80s, right.
Yeah. I think I did it for 5 years or so. Anyway, to write about art and politics, which was fine. Once a month. And then this new guy came in and he fired me. And I went in to talk to him and see what was going on. And he said, "It's not about your politics." And I said, "Well, that's interesting that you brought that up so immediately." So it must have been about my politics. But the Voice, for God's sake.
But they never gave you a real reason?
No. Jeff Weinstein was the betrayer. He was the editor, and he should have stood up for me, and he didn't. So I've never really understood what... I got fired from a lot of things.
But that seems like a really odd sort of dismissal.
Then I went to, In These Times, or...
In These Times, yeah.
Yeah, and they more or less fired me.
Why?
And then I went to Z magazine.
But why? Why did?
I don't know. They never said much, and by that time I was like, eh.
Okay.
I was interested in doing something else. I didn't really. I was in Boulder a half a year. I wrote from Boulder for Z, I guess, and they got rid of me too. It didn't make that much difference in my life, but I never was clear about. Maybe it was too much about art for the political things, and too much about politics for the art things.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
The establishment art world was very against what she was doing, supporting political artists, supporting work that was not mainstream. Even her support early on of Eva Hesse and eccentric abstraction and certain forms of feminist art like Judy Chicago, those things were not considered mainstream. And somebody who was an important critic at the time, Hilton Kramer on the New York Times, would never review those works. So the fact that she came out of art history and was a really good writer, could write about pop art, could write about political art. What made a difference really to me is that she's a really good art critic. She's a good writer. And she can also write about things like ecology, like when she turned her mind to different parts of the art world that weren't really being covered. She probably got pushed back. I wouldn't really know. I saw I saw people like Roz Krauss who were, against feminist art or against political art, or feeling that it was impure, that the art that she was speaking up for was not considered mainstream art at the time. Now you might consider that Nancy Spiro is somebody who might be in a museum, but in those days, Leon and Nancy, nobody showed them. And, except for AIR, and Leon couldn't get shown. Those kind of political artists, the new museum was just starting, and they were starting to show what they called alternative art. But, she really was the one who put it on the map, partially because of her really good writing skills and her advocacy. I mean, she was very involved with the Art Workers Coalition that was also against the Vietnam War. And she was involved with printed matter, which was very important because people were starting to show artists' books, and Heresies, which was a very important starting point for me looking at this collective. I even went to a meeting with her and Anna Minchetta. I tried to join the issue on ecology. They said it was an open call. And I was so intimidated by Lucy and Anna that I never went back. It was like, they were so scary to me as a young person. So she was everywhere. And she really came out, and like, I was in a little group on the Lower East Side of women called the Limbo Lounge. And she came and spoke to us. It wasn't an important group. It was just a group of women who formed together. We were doing shows together. And she came and talked to us, and I feel that openness really went missing when she moved out to New Mexico, and kind of, I'm glad for her that she got time to herself to do her own work. But she was so present during those years, that I think that made a big difference, to have an art critic who is actually also willing to, to be an activist.
So what has it been like living in New Mexico in general?
Heavenly. I mean, I love being outdoors until my knee bit the dust a few years ago. So I spent a lot of time hiking and camping, and a lot of good friends. And, I'm really glad I did what I did. And so I've never really regretted any decisions. And I've made some stupid ones, I think. But
haven't we all?
Yeah, but, they've always worked out.
So how do you think it's impacted your writing and the way and the different ideas that you're interested in?
Well, I think, New Mexico has made a big impression. I've written 3 books on New Mexico.
Right.
And
your Galisteo book is quite great.
The Galisteo, then there's the one on the Galisteo Basin that came before. That was archaeology and history, and really no art. I mean, none of them really have much art in them. I stick in some art now and then, but. And then I did the text for a book on Chaco Canyon that a photographer friend of mine did.
I wanted to talk about Chaco Canyon shortly.
Oh, well, let's talk about Chaco Canyon.
I love that talk. Okay, go ahead.
No, I went to Chaco Canyon first in 1972, and it's a fascinating place.
Yeah.
And New Mexico is fascinating. My partner was raised in New Mexico, in Alamogordo, is White Sands. But we for the pandemic, every Sunday we take a 4 to 7 hour drive around the back roads of New Mexico. And even though he was raised here, we always find things that are fascinating, and it's a really interesting. It's got so many layers of history, and I think old age gets you more interested in history or something.
Maybe. But then even like someone like David Wojnarowicz found Chaco Canyon.
Oh yes, and I didn't know for years that was where that face thing of his came.
So what do you think the draw is of Chaco Canyon?
I always talk about the mystery of Chaco Canyon, and it is very mysterious. I mean, in a funny way, we know more and more about it.
So Lucy Lippard wasn't simply getting away from the New York art world, but maybe she was going towards something else. Like the native cultures in the Southwest, where prominent sites like Chaco Canyon continue to enthrall visitors from all over the world. Between 850 and 1250 CE, Chaco Canyon was the home to the Pueblo people, who created some fascinating artifacts and grand buildings that you can see even today. A sacred site It's also sacred to the Hopi and Navajo people. I myself had the pleasure of visiting Chaco Canyon, and I can tell you, it really is unlike anything you've ever seen.
But like you said, there are so many layers. It seems
yeah,
never
and
ending.
it's such a strange place. I mean, why is it there? And a good friend of mine is Anna Sofair, who really broke open the astronomical aspects of it, and the archaeologists were all like, didn't like what she was doing, and this is bullshit and so forth. And now they're all realize that it's there and they have to deal with it. But
right.
So
how dare someone tell them,
really.
Right?
And she came out of art. She was an artist, and she saw things, I think, that they didn't see by just being an artist. And
sometimes art and like good writing is making connections other people don't make.
Yeah,
right?
hopefully.
Right.
Yeah. So I saw it at an impressionable time of my life, and I've been back lots of times, and it's just still fascinating.
So what captured your imagination about Chaco Canyon?
By the time I got down here, I had already become interested in Native American art. The American Indian Community House was very briefly in the Leo Castelli building on West Broadway.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I went in, I always saw everything. And I went in, and Peter Jemison and Jolene Rickart were directing it. They were talking to me as I was wandering around, and they said, "You don't know anything about American Indian art, do you?" And I said, "No, how would I?" And they said, took me in hand, kind of, and decided to educate me.
Oh.
And there was a show at the Queen's Museum at the time of George Longfish, and I went out to see that, which I might not have done otherwise.
So that's an interesting connection. I didn't know about that early connection to learning about Native American
And then
art.
Harmony was living down here, teaching at UNM briefly. Anyway, she knew Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who was down here. And they did a show called Women of Cedar and Sage about Native women. And Harmony probably said, let's get Lucy to do a text. And so I came down, I spent time with Jean and Ramona Sequestoa, who's a good artist here. And she was a weaver at that point, and Hopi. And that between that and Peter and Jolene, I started getting really interested in Native stuff. And then in Boulder, I went on trips to the Four Corners and stuff with photographers, people I knew, and camping trips and seeing a lot of rock art. And I fell for rock art. And when I got down here, I got to know Polly Shaftsma, who's the doyen of all southwestern rock art. And we hiked and saw stuff and so on. And she's still a close friend. I mean, the West interested me. My grandmother told me stories about the West because she was raised in Dakota Territory, Wyoming, and Colorado. My grandkids started calling me, my oldest grandson started calling me Cowboy Grandma because I lived in the West. And then when he was a little older, he said, why aren't you Cowgirl Grandma? And I said, well, I am. And so the whole Pueblo culture is not something I'd ever known anything about until, when Charles and I came down because he wanted to go to Chalico at Zuni, and that was my first. We went to dances at other Pueblos, and I was like, whoa, this is so interesting. So that was another opening up. I mean, I don't do so well doing the same thing over and over again, so I'm always kind of, when something else comes along, I'm excited. So.
Absolutely.
So one of her intellectual interests seems to be Indigenous work, and particularly her book around Chaco Canyon and a lot of that. How do you think that fits into the larger?
I mean, I think it really fits into Lucy's profound sense of thinking about issues of equity in a political sense. I think that, as we just were talking about, the community of artists that were part of the downtown scene in the 60s and 70s when she was really involved in conceptualism was white, middle class, driven by male thoughts and directives largely. But there was a lot of other communities, as we know, doing other really important work blocks away from where that was happening. And somehow those stories haven't been told. And I think one of the things that really Lucy took on personally, particularly when she was on the mother board of the Heresies Collective, was thinking through her own positionality and the voices of the BIPOC and non-white people who were excluded, and that she was a part of that story to some degree. And how could she, respond to that in a way that was productive. And I think that aligned with her also burgeoning interest in thinking about the land and thinking about the environment and thinking about climate. And I think that those things come together very easily for her in that intellectual way, conceptual way.
So now, in terms of the, kind of your imagination, where does it live today?
Do I have one? Where would it live? Where does yours live?
Mine lives often in art. That's why I write about art. That's what I say.
Yeah. I don't think mine is in art particularly. More in the world, the outside, outdoors. And that's kind of where, New Mexico it sparks imagination all over the place, I guess.
So the way you talk about about your writing and sort of like where your imagination lives sounds very much like your writing in general, where it's sort of like there are these journeys you take.
Yeah, I'm sure that's. I often say this is why I don't do interviews, but I often say that I don't think until I have a keyboard in front of me. Instead of this thing now, these damn things.
You're pointing at your laptop.
People, and people say, if you're writing, since I never taught, I never learned how to write in the air. I have friends who teach, it's incredibly articulate, and when I'm on panels and stuff, I think, oh wow, if I had a keyboard, I could have said that. But how is it different writing online? Because all of your work is online, basically.
Yeah. It's my passion.
Yeah.
I find it's. I think because we're talking about image and text, you don't have any real, barriers to include a video clip, include as many photographs as you want, which I find very freeing.
Yeah.
But I also love hyperlinks. I love the links to other things. I think that's such an important part of the writing that I feel like I miss when I write in print.
Oh, that's so interesting, yeah.
Do you know? Because I feel like it allows me to talk about something without having to necessarily always going into the history, let's say, because I can put a link if you want to learn more.
Sure.
And it allows me to get to the point. But I just love that the citational poetry of it. Do you know?
That's wonderful, yeah.
Do you know? I love that part.
I never have written for online, and it's as far as I'm concerned, it's like, it's not really, I read your writing and everybody's, and it's fine online, but for myself, I don't want to write online.
Absolutely. Well, it's like the decision not to have a television.
Well, it's bad enough with this thing.
Yeah.
I don't surf at all, but I do find myself drifting into, for a few minutes of an animal thing or something.
A few minutes, let's say in a couple of hours.
Yeah, well, I don't do that. but I do look up some of these, they found this animal in the bushes, and I think, ooh, I want to read that.
Absolutely. No, I could totally relate. So from your perch here in Galisteo, how has the world changed for you?
Galisteo, in a funny way, I think I broadened my view by being here. At the same time, I narrowed it down to a tiny community, which is contradictory, but
also sounds right.
Yeah, because I always tried to work with communities and stuff, and I was never really a community organizer on any level, but I liked the idea of being in a community. And I was 55. I thought I was old.
Totally. Well, I'm thinking of like many artists, writers that never leave their towns, right?
Yeah.
That see the world and can tell you about the world in so many ways.
Yeah.
So you asked about why Lucy moved to the Southwest and kind of that, was she taking herself away from the world? What's fascinating to me is the number of women artists of that generation who moved out there, right? You have Nancy Holt, you have Harmony Hammond, you have Mae Stevens, who was a very close friend. You have Judy Chicago. So I think that Lucy saw herself as moving very much into a community, actually, of people who had settled out there and were working in that context, which, if you want to throw George O'Keeffe into that mix, too, I don't know that she'd want to be there, but, it's part of the story. So I think there's a way in which she did not see it as that far out of the art world, not the art world that she was a part of and the people she was friends with.
So... Galisteo has this incredible reputation of this little cluster of really smart, accomplished people.
Well, it annoys me because there are some of us here, but basically it's a village that's, founded by Hispanos, and there are still, they're in the minority now because the village has been so gentrified. I mean, when I moved here, one old lady, a local lady, said to me, "We like your house because it's so small." I mean, because it wasn't a mansion, and this side of the creek has never been the fancy part, and now it's.
I see there's some fancier places.
Well, now it's the most interesting. I mean, we've also got the fire department and the community center right here.
So you do the community newsletter here at Galisteo?
I've done it for 25 years now, I think.
So what's that been like?
It's been wonderful. But when I first was here, I was helping build part of the fire station. And somebody said, "Oh, you're a writer." And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, we have something called Fire Flyer," which was one sheet, which came out. I never saw any more than one, I don't think. And they said, "Will you write something about what fun it is to help build the fire department?" So I said, I did. And then somebody said something about there was a guy in the fire department, lovely gay guy who was much too much of an activist already, and so he wanted to do a newsletter. So, and I said, well, I would love to work on it or whatever, and I've done a lot of editing and things. And then he called me during the summer and he said, "My partner's leaving me because I'm too involved with too many things." So you can do the newsletter. And so I took it to the community association, and one woman said, one of the local women who was the Patron family, which is the rich family in town, and she said, "We don't need no local history." She said, "All the old people are at each other's throats about things that happened 100 years ago," and I thought that was pretty silly, but it was perfectly true.
Right.
But anyway, everybody else was pretty enthused about doing it, and so they gave me the okay, and so I've done it ever since, and it's I love doing it. It's called El Puente de Galisteo, and
it's printed.
Oh yeah, it's printed. People every now and then somebody says, "Oh, just it's a hassle because I have to." Every month it's about 150 things, and I have to sit down and stamp and sticker and label and so forth, but I can listen to the news and do that. And Jim helps me sometimes.
Totally. Also, I mean, speaking of your experience in terms of like books like 6 Years, this idea of like creating this anthology or compilation of disparate events is kind of what a newsletter is, no?
Yeah. My friends from out of Galisteo are always wanting to subscribe, and they don't get to. I mean, I said, "No, this is for Galisteans, and
totally.
we pay for it, and it's slow." My son gets it, and I don't think he pays much attention to it, but it's the only one I send it to.
But I see a commonality. You were kind of doing something similar for the conceptual art movement.
Yeah.
Now you're doing it for your town and your village in a way. You're sort of like helping write this history.
And I did this thing. So
yeah. So the book you just handed me
so
is
this
called
is
Village of Galisteo: Historical Timeline 1814 to 2014.
Yeah. And it's just a little booklet. We've published 2 or 3 books, little books like that. El Puente Press. This one I think I paid for, but I love doing it. It keeps me in touch with everything.
But I mean, to speak of your writing in general, you were one of the first art writers to really bring the I in.
I couldn't help it.
Yeah. But I think that is more revolutionary than I think people realize.
But see, in my day, you didn't learn how to do art writing. I mean, there's no courses in curating or art writing or anything. You just did it. And most of the people, when I gave this talk at the New School several years ago, I said at the beginning, "Okay, how many people are in the audience are art writers?" And a lot of people raised their hands. And then I said, "And how many of you thought that was what you were going to do for your living?" And
almost not.
Nobody raised their hand. Because in those days, everybody wanted to be a poet, and I wanted to write fiction.
And so many early art writers were poets.
Yeah, and they were.
Yeah, the other part of Lucy's story is she has spent a lot of time in Maine and still does every summer. And so I think that for her, the kind of sweep of the United States is just part of the playing field that she's interested in, particularly as she's gotten, in the last decades, really involved in ideas of land art. And that I also believe grows out of her feminism.
Really? So how would you connect those things?
Well, I think the book Overlay does a lot of that work, right? The idea of the way that women in particular approached land art, and Mendieta primary among them, I think really drove an interest and expanded an instinct with Lucy's critical thinking about an examination of the land and what the land holds.
So now I'd love to ask you a little bit about land art, because I think being in New Mexico, at least I can't help think about it a little bit, because
Yeah.
the landscape plays such a big role.
Well, I wrote something for one of the land art catalogs or something saying, where I asked myself what kind of land art I would like to see here. None. The land interests me far more than whereas land art interested me a lot. I always call it an urban interest, an urban art, really, colonizing ruralism, or whatever.
So how do you resolve that between that?
Well, I haven't, I like art about land, but I don't like art that fucks around with the land.
Right.
Originally, earthworks were fascinating because they were so different, and they did get you out of the city. It was an escape from the art gallery world and so on. I mean, I love Spiral Jetty. I love Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels and Charles Ross's Star Axis, which isn't done yet, but I can't stand what Heiser does. I mean, if you walk around the land here, even a coyote trail or just a little walking path can become a gully so easily, and he's made this huge gully. Like the landscape doesn't need more gullies. It's just annoying. So I got more interested in land use than land art. Earthworks have had their day, I think. I mean, when all of us urban folks go west, we get excited.
Smitten by the landscape.
Yes, I mean, I did a BBC interview at one point, and they were interviewing all artists all over New Mexico, and everybody was talking about the light and the this and the that. And I said, yeah, but it's one of the poorest states in the Union. Land is about people. It's cultural landscapes are what really interests me. I mean, I like wilderness as well as the next person, what's left of it. But the cultural landscape is far more interesting to me. And that's partly looking at, there are 8 Pueblo ruins in the Galisteo Basin. And that fascinates me. I mean, you can't walk. I mean, see all this stuff under here, in that. That's all stuff I found on my land, and they're this old arrowheads and
other
these
flint
sort of
rocks.
Spearhead things and so forth. So.
Oh wow!
And that just all came up from by my pump house.
Wow.
So anyway, and I've always loved rocks for some reason. The house is full of rocks, and that I liked rocks most of my life somehow. And
I'm almost sensing a theme of time in your interest.
Time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I called
fair?
the Chaco book time and time again. I loved that title. I was so glad he went with it. I mean,
Do you have a spiritual practice?
No, none.
No. Okay.
I'm an atheist, and that's. I mean, I suspect there's something out there. I mean,
Sure.
I'm not totally stupid, but
Sure.
it doesn't. It interested me for a while, and it doesn't really anymore. No, my parents were liberals and agnostics, and I had to go them one better, so I became socialist and atheist.
Why not?
Yeah, really.
Why not? How do you maintain hope? And how do you continue to be true to your ideals when, clearly a lot of people don't have the same commitment you do?
Oh, I don't know if it's commitment or habit.
Could be both. Could be both.
I don't maintain hope. I mean, I think this is a pretty incredibly hopeless moment. So I'm not particularly hopeful, but I've never been depressed. I mean, I don't have a depressive personality or whatever. So, just
are you an optimist?
I think I have been off and on, but I don't know if I remember somebody said pessimism is a waste of time, and I like that, but. So I'm not really a pessimist, but I can't say I'm an optimist either. I mean, I don't go around being hopeless, but privately I don't have a whole lot of optimism about anything that's going down now. But we always, I mean, people are, capable of changing things, and hopefully we will before it's too damn late.
You're so refreshingly realistic.
I guess so, yeah. But I'm privileged. I mean, I
Right.
make a living, and I have a nice place to live in, and
Sure.
and so forth. So, it's. I think if I were one of these poor souls who'd just been burned out by these fires, I would be pretty hopeless. They don't have insurance. Nobody will insure those little villages anyway because they are.
You're talking about recent fires around here.
Fires huge.
I saw they were
going. 300,000 acres.
Oh wow! I didn't realize it was that large.
Oh yeah, it's like 400 square miles or something.
And this is becoming a chronic.
600 square miles. I can't remember the date.
It's becoming a perennial issue. Do you think part of your interest in Chaco Canyon is the environmental part of it? Because people talk about the environmental.
Well, Chaco is sort of anti-environmental. That's one of the interesting things about it. They went miles away for building materials and stuff, but they chose this place for some spiritual reason, and that's really a mystery. I mean, and the Pueblo people talk about it in a different way than we look at it, and the Pueblo people don't believe in ruins. And they don't like rock art to be rock art because it's not art.
It's living.
It's life, yeah. And I still use the word rock art because it's beautiful. But the fact that nothing is a ruin because the spirits are still there and it's alive.
Right.
It isn't dead.
Right.
And that's kind of fascinating. I mean, but I don't necessarily believe. I mean, I'm not a Pueblo person, so...
No, I understand.
Yeah, so.
No, but I just wonder if, like, Chaco Canyon and part of your interest is also, in some ways, it might be our future in a way. Like, and it's not the only Pueblo civilization that, changed according to the environmental reality.
Yeah, but it is really, it's unique. It's a very peculiar place.
So what do you feel like one thing you've taken away from Lucy's work that you feel like stays with you in terms of your own curatorial practice, when you put maybe the experience putting together the exhibition? Is there something, or maybe a work of hers that is the one that stays with you the most?
Well, the work that, of course, will always stay with me is 6 years. One of the takeaways that I think I've gotten from Lucy is her pragmatism. I think that she is a person who thinks deeply and thinks critically, but also doesn't lose track of the kind of human aspect of all of this stuff that we're all doing. And I think that's very important. And I think that doesn't stop her from using her voice in the way that she thinks is most important and has the most value as a social idea. But at the same time, when you meet her, she takes what she does very seriously, but she does not take herself that seriously. And that's always a refreshing thing.
What have you seen younger or emerging feminists sort of look at her work and sort of admire the most?
I think that what people admire most about Lucy is, as I've said, is that she has really stuck to her beliefs and to her values. And she keeps writing. I guess I am glad to hear you ask the question because I want people to be thinking about Lucy, and I hope they are. That would be a great takeaway from this conversation, for example. I do think that generational knowledge of people who've come before them ebbs and flows depending on what conversations are being had. So I think it's time for a new edited book of Lucy's essays.
What a great idea.
I want to just say that I totally admire her, and I think it's very unusual for an art critic to be so generous and so supportive of artists. A lot of art critics at that time, and even now, would stand back from being involved with artists. And she really threw herself into the politics of the time, which were, very intense. If you wanted to get involved with something, it wasn't like a small matter to have a meeting with, the Art Workers Coalition, these kind of fierce guys in overalls. And she just would go in, and I have to say she was unintimidated by what was, a rather controversial time period. That's what I really admire about her, is that she was willing to stand up and say what she thought and to really put forward the people she wanted to put forward. She didn't go for that kind of mainstream approach. I think in the end, that's what makes her work stand out from that time period.
Is there anything you want to end with, Lucy?
No.
Well, I just want to say thank you because it was a real
Well,
pleasure.
I'm sorry that I didn't know you were going to be such a good interviewer. That an hour is all I can do.
Well, I mean, I was honored with even just an hour, but it's just more to sort of understand a little bit about where your writing comes from, because I think the writing still resonates with so many of us.
Oh, that's nice.
And I think that's really
That's good.
powerful.
That made my day.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. This podcast is edited by producer Isabella Segalovich. And a quick word from our sponsor, Hyperallergic Members. Hyperallergic is an independent art publication based here in New York. And we pride ourselves in telling it like it is. We're not supported by billionaires. We are not some pet project of a bunch of people who think that they can game the art world. We are the real thing. We do independent journalism, trying to get at the crux of the issue, whatever it may be. We're not focused on the art market. We're focused on what artists and people who love art care about. But keep in mind, we can only do this with your support. So we hope you become a Hyperallergic member for only $80 a year, or if you'd prefer, $8 a month. You can help ensure that the art world will be held accountable. And as you heard in this episode, we are very proud to bring you stories that you may not hear anywhere else. And if you'd like to learn more, you can always visit the website, hyperallergic.com. This year, we celebrated 15 years of Hyperallergic. That's 15 years representing the voices of the 99% and not only the 1%. I'm Harag Vartanyan, the editor-in-chief and co-founder of Hyperallergic. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.